Hey everybody. If you were in class on Wednesday, we talked some about printmaking and we got into photography a little bit and talked about this device called a camera obscura, which is Latin for dark room. And as you can see, it was a dark room. And if you put a lens in it or just the right size hole, you can see a projection of what's outside. That evolved into a device to help people paint and draw. And then over time, it kept evolving, and it got smaller and it got better optics. It was still a drawing tool up until the early 1800s when people figured out how to make an image with light by itself, and that's what really created photography. We also talked some about the first photographic images and the idea of the daguerreotype, which was a photographic print on a metal plate. There was no negative, so it was a one-of-a-kind print. Everything was reversed from left to right. And this piece, because of the way the photographic process worked, even though the street was full of people, nobody showed up except for the guy who was stopped to have his shoe shined. And then because he stood still so long, he showed up on the daguerreotype, which again was a metal plate. It didn't really have any white tones on it, so if you actually held it and looked at it, the place that looks white would actually be reflective, like a mirror. We also talked about how a gelatin silver print is made in a darkroom because silver media is sensitive to light, so film and photographic paper now are covered with silver, and that's how images were made up until very recently, around the 1990s, when digital cameras became prominent. With that photographic paper, that silver coated substance, it is possible to make images without a camera. Man Ray was one artist that was doing that, and he called his artworks rayographs. Most people refer to these now as photograms, with the idea that you don't necessarily need a typical camera, that you can shine light onto this paper and then record shadows on it, and as a result you get this surrealistic and sometimes dreamlike type of image. In photography, the term exposure is used to describe how much light strikes either that sensitive paper or that piece of film that's coated with silver, or now a digital sensor. The amount of light that strikes that determines what your image looks like, and that's called exposure. And the basic principle is, if you get too much exposure, you let too much light into the camera, your image is too light, like the one on the bottom. If you don't get enough light into your camera, your image is too dark, like the one in the middle. And ideally, you have the right amount of exposure, which is the one in the upper left-hand corner. And in order to get that exposure, there are different types of meters that actually measure light, and then you can transfer those settings from that meter onto your camera and get the right exposure. In order to determine the proper exposure, or the amount of light that comes into the camera, there are a couple of basic controls, and one of those is aperture. And the term aperture describes the opening in a camera lens, and it's like the pupil in your eye. So that opening can be small in very bright light situations, or it could be larger to let in more light. Apertures are usually described in terms of f-stops, like the example that you see right here. f2 is a fraction of the total lens opening, so it's wide, and then as the number gets larger, the opening gets smaller, like f16 is a small opening. Easy way to remember that is just like that pupil in your eyeball. Aperture also affects what's called depth of field in photographs, what's going to be in focus from near to far. So you may have seen photographs where maybe a person was sharp and then the background was nice and blurry and soft. That's done in part by manipulating that aperture control. Another control is called shutter speed. So the aperture is small or large, the shutter opens and closes, and it could open and close quickly or slowly depending on, again, how much light is present and how much you need to let into the camera. Those two controls, shutter speed and aperture, also have a lot of effect over what that final image is going to look like. Cameras have what are called different formats, which is like the size of the film or the digital negative, and it was common for art photographers in the 1900s to use this type of camera called a view camera, and it took a large format negative. So the negative itself could be as large as 8 by 10, which is a huge amount of information. That's one way that Ansel Adams was able to create the images that he did. It looked so sharp and so crisp, and he had control over all the blacks and whites, and they're just amazing photographs, and you've probably seen them before on a calendar or on a poster. Really well-known American photographer, Ansel Adams. What we know now as the point-and-shoot camera came about as early as 1900, and this was the Brownie camera that was put out by Eastman Kodak. You could buy this camera. It came with a roll of film. You exposed the film just by pushing a button. It didn't have very complicated controls, and then you send the whole camera back to Kodak. They put a new roll of film in it. They process your images and send it back to you. Very soon after that, most households in the United States had a camera, and so for the first time in history you get to see inside of everyday people's lives. Now keep in mind that portraits and things like that, if you commissioned someone to paint a portrait, you had to have a lot of money to hire somebody to do that. But with the Brownie camera, you can make images of yourself and your family and your yard and your animals much cheaper. So it really did change the way people viewed society, because they were seeing all these different aspects of it. And people that had never traveled before could see all parts of the world through this new medium. It seems really strange to me to define film, because it was so much a part of life, again, up until around, I guess, the mid-1990s is when the first digital cameras were being taken seriously, and one of those was a Nikon 3 megapixel, I think, that cost around $1,500 and made a really small print, and digital just kept evolving from there. But anyway, film is usually plastic, and it has a light sensitive emulsion on it, and that emulsion is usually silver. So just in case you didn't know what film was, that's what it is. Cameras being lighter and smaller, more portable, allowed more expression when it came to art. And so art photographers didn't have to be scientists that carted around this big wagon full of stuff. You know, you could just take your camera and walk around and shoot what you saw. The genre of street photography became popular, and people like Henri Cartier-Bresson in France became world famous for their street photographs. Now, Bresson coined this phrase, the decisive moment. So according to him, if you always had your camera and you were always looking and seeing what was going on, things would line up in front of you in the perfect way for you to make a photograph. And when you look at a lot of Bresson's work, like this piece, it does seem like things just lined up perfectly. A lot of aspects of the photograph, like the man frozen in midair as he's jumping over the puddle, and then the perfect reflection in the water, and then the background, the way it fits into the picture, it just came out perfectly. Street photography also starts to become a tool for social change. If you never saw a certain section of the society in the way that a photograph can show it to you in detail, and that association with the actual and reality, then it's difficult to understand what other people's point of view would look like. So images like this one, 5-cent lodging, it was about the plight of many of the working poor in these overcrowded, dirty conditions where a lot of people got sick, and there just wasn't really a decent living condition. And photographs like this help change that and enact laws about standards of housing, and also standards in the workplace, things like child labor. The photographs by Joseph Rees helped draw attention to that. And there are a lot of photographers that have looked at society as a place that needed some improvement, and through the presentation of these images and letting people see things from different points of view, have helped to enact that social change. Many photographic artists today look for ways to make a unique print, ways to become more expressive with their images than just using the latest technology. And so you get processes like this one the unique ilfochrome print. Artists looking for ways to make their image express exactly what they want it to, and not necessarily in a high-tech way. I had the pleasure of meeting Ben Don. He was an artist in residence at Hollins University a few years back, and Ben Don's parents are Vietnamese, and they immigrated to the United States, and a lot of his work has to do with looking back at some aspects of their lives in different ways. And he did this really interesting process called a chlorophyll print, where he would actually use the action of the sun to print negatives onto leaves. So it's the leaf itself becoming a way to create a photographic image involving exposure. Also, he had a machine that he was using to create his own daguerreotypes. So that same process that we talked about back in the 1800s, Ben Don was using that in his contemporary photography, and he was showing, in particular, some parts of Asia on these daguerreotypes, which gave the landscape a different look than it would look in any other type of photograph. And it created some really interesting pieces, and heck of a nice guy too, Ben Don. Do you ever notice that when you take a trip or you travel somewhere, you're having fun, it seems just as important that you take a photograph of that than it was to be there to begin with? And that's one criticism that people have of photography as an art form and just as technology in general. And to me, that's what this piece is about. You see, I am here after all. That the idea that through photography we feel like we have to prove ourselves constantly. There's that saying, if there's no photo, then it didn't happen. So we're going around, instead of experiencing life, sometimes we're just trying to validate ourselves or prove that we were having fun, and whether we were or not. And that's kind of an interesting idea, interesting direction for artwork. Manipulating photographs is nothing new. It's nothing new. It's gone on since the invention of photography. And those aspects of exposure that we talked about before, aperture and shutter speed, are enough to really manipulate a photograph. There were spirit photographers in the 1800s that would travel, and they would have a darkroom set up in their wagon, and for a certain price they could come into your house and tell you whether or not you had any spirits in there. And what they were really doing is just setting up that camera in low light and using a really long shutter speed and just walking through the picture very slowly. And as a result, when they showed the finished image to the homeowner, it had that mysterious figure moving through it, and oh, that must be your Uncle Joe that died here last year. That'll be $10 or whatever they were charging. So that kind of manipulation has always been possible, but now with digital photographs, it's even easier than ever. And really, sometimes at the push of a button, you can create a scene that never really happened. And then because it is a photograph, it always calls into question, was that real? We've all heard the saying, photographs don't lie, but they certainly do. They lie all the time. And that's become a big issue with ethics in journalism, and maybe we'll look at an article about that on Monday. The term resolution refers to how you can see the information in a photograph. And more specifically, in terms of digital photographs, resolution refers to the amount of digital information available to create a photograph, usually expressed in megapixels. So that Nikon camera in the mid-1990s had a 3 megapixel sensor, and now you can get a cell phone that has a 40 megapixel sensor. And with that much resolution, what that gives you the ability to do is to make a huge print. You can make a poster-sized print that's razor sharp. Or you can take a photograph, and if you have that much information, you can zoom in on it, and you can take just a little piece of it and blow that up. So that is the relationship to megapixels when it comes to photography. Also, to a certain extent, megapixels are going to affect the clarity and the detail in any photograph you take, because the more information, the better. But megapixels aren't everything, and if you're going to pay a lot of money for a camera, I would go for maybe a reasonable amount of megapixels and a really good lens, really good piece of glass, and you'll be surprised at what that will do. Hey, that's a good place to stop for today. I'm going to include a video I did last year, a little blurb about a cool camera I've got, and you can check it out. And I don't remember if I say anything time specific in that video or not, but anyway, check it out too. Also check out the video link to a photographer named Vic Muniz giving his TED Talk. He's awesome, and he's just a really funny, talented guy, and I think you'll enjoy that. Have a super weekend. Read the chapter about cinematography on Monday, and we'll talk about it then. See you later.